Hello everyone, my topic is all about policies on agrarian reform. But before that, I will discuss first the agrarian reform. What is agrarian reform? It is the redistribution of lands to farmers and to regular farm workers who are landless. It is essentially the tarification of the whole system of agriculture in the Philippines. Moreover, it is also centered on the relationship of farmers between production and distribution of land among farmers. Focus on political and economic class character through genuine and comprehensive agrarian reform. Philippines would be able to gain more from its agricultural potential that uplift the Filipinos in the agriculture sector, who have been suffered poverty for the longest time. Policies on agrarian reform. Agrarian reform is essentially the rectification of the whole system of agriculture. An important aspect of the Philippine economy because nearly half of the population is employed in the agricultural sector, and most citizens live in rural areas. Agrarian reform is centered on the relationship between production and the distribution of land among farmers. It is also focused on the political and economic class character of the relations of production and distribution in farming and related enterprises, and how this connect to the wider class structure. Through genuine and comprehensive agrarian reform, the Philippines would be able to gain more from its agricultural potential and uplift the Filipinos in the agricultural sector, who have been, for the longest time, suffering in poverty and discontent. In our attempt to understand the development of agrarian reform in the Philippines, we turn our attention to our country's history, especially our colonial past, where we could find the root of the agrarian was the country has experienced up to this very day. Importance of policies on agrarian reform. Agrarian reform contributed to relieve the unemployment pressure and to increase agricultural production and productivity, although it could not prevent a massive exodus of rural population from the mountains and the most marginal areas.
Land ownership in the Philippines under Spain. When the Spaniards came to the Philippines, the concept of Pueblo agriculture was introduced. It is a system wherein native rural communities were organized into pueblo and Christianized native families were given 4 to 5 hectares of land to cultivate. The native families were not allowed to own their land. They were just the landholders but not the landowners, because the land assigned to them was owned by the King of Spain, where they paid their colonial tributes in the form of agricultural products they produced. Also, the Spaniards introduced the concept of encomienda system to the Philippines. Encomienda system is a legal system by which the Spanish crown attempted to define the status of the indigenous population. It is where a large tracts of land were given to Spaniards for them to manage and have the rights to collect tributes from the Indians. But the encomenderos started to abuse their powers by renting their lands to a few powerful landlords, and the native who once freely cultivated the land became share tenants. They did not even have a right to the land. They were forced to sell their products at a very low price or surrender their products to the encomenderos. Then, the encomenderos will resell it for profit. Filipinos in encomienda were also required to render services to their encomenderos that were unrelated to farming. In the end, the natives become virtual slaves of the encomenderos. Later on, the encomienda system evolved into the hacienda system. It was developed in the beginning of the 19th century as the Spanish government implemented policies that would fast-track the colony into the capitalist world. The economy was tied to the world market as the Philippines became an exporter of raw materials and the importer of goods. The hacienderos expanded their influence in all the sectors of economy. Agricultural experts were demanded and the hacienda system was developed as a new form of ownership.
Ownership in the Philippines under the American period. So, the Americans were aware that the main cause of social unrest here in the Philippines was landlessness, and they attempted to put an end to the deplorable conditions of the tenant farmers by passing several land policies to increase the small landholders and distribute ownership to a bigger number of Filipino tenants and farmers. So, ang mga Amerikano kay aware na kung ang main cause ng social unrest diri sa Pilipinas, wherein ang kakuangan sang duta. So nag-attempt sila nga magbutang sang para ma-end na ang deplorable conditions sa within the tenant and the tenant farmers nga ilang sa mga nangungupahan nga mga mag-uuma nga makapasay sa several land policies nga para ma-increase, mapataas ang mga small landholders, ma-distribute sa ownership niya mga bigger of number of Filipino tenants farmers. So, significant legislation enacted during the American period. Philippine Bill of 1902 set the ceiling on the hectareage of private individuals and corporation may acquire 16 has for private individuals and 1,024 has for corporation. Land Registration Act of 1902, Act number 496, provided for a comprehensive registration of the titles under the Turin system. Next is the Public Land of 1903, introduced an homestead system in the Philippines. Tenancy Act of 1933, Act number 4054 and 4113, regulated relationship between sa landowners and tenants of rice, 50-50 shaving and sugarcane lands. And then is the Turin system, which the Americans instituted for the registration of land, did not solve any problem completely. Either they were not aware of the law or they did. They could not pay the survey costs, other fees required in applying for Turin's title. So, Sakdal or Sakdalista was a peasant rebellion in the Central Luzon that lasted for 2 days, May 2 to 3 only, 1935. It was easily crushed. So, dali lang siya nawaha tungod sa government forces. But then, historical events tells of the social inequality brought by issues in land ownership and tenancy in the country. So, the Filipino word sakdal means is to accuse, mag-akusa, titled by newspaper helmed by Benigno Ramos. He railed support from Manila and nearby provinces through the publication which led to the establishment of the Partido Sakdalista in 1933. Demanded reforms from the government such as the abolition of taxes and equal or common ownership of land among others. So, land ownership here in the Philippines did not improve during the American period. In fact, it even worsens because there was no limit to the size of land holdings, so people could easily process and access and have the easily accessibility of possession was limited to those who could buy, register, and acquire fixed property titles. Then, President Quezon laid down a social justice program focused on the purchase of haciendas, which were to be divided and sold to tenants. So, his administration also created the National Rice and Concern Corporation or NARIC to assign public defenders to assist peasants in court battles for the rights of lands and court of industrial relationship or relation to exercise jurisdiction over disagreements arising from the landowner-tenant relationship. So para ma-exercise ang jurisdiction kay sa over sa disagreement nga noon ni usbong between sa tag-iya kag sa nangungupahan. So The homestead program also continued through the National Land Settlement Administration or NLSA. Efforts toward agrarian reform by the Commonwealth failed because of many problems. So, such as budget allocation for the settlement program and widespread peasant uprising World War II put a halt to all inventions to solve this problem as the Japanese occupied the country.
Post-war inversion towards agrarian reform. The first president in line is Manuel A. Rojas. The rehabilitation and rebuilding after the war was focused on providing solutions to the problem of the past. The Republic Act No. 34 was passed and it was to establish a 70 to 30 sharing arrangement between the tenant and the landlord, respectively, and reduce the interest of landowners loan to tenants at least 6% or less. The government also attempted to redistribute hacienda lands, falling prey to the woes of the similar attempts since no support was given to small farmers who were sold lands. The next president is Elpidio Quirino. The Land Settlement Development Corporate was established to accelerate and expand the resettlement program to peasant or a poor farmer of low social status who owns or rents a small piece of land for cultivation. Ramon Magsaysay. This agency later on became the National Resettlement and Rehabilitation Administration. He saw the importance of pursuing a genuine land reform and program and convinced Congress majority of which landed elites to pass legislation to improve the lawful reform situation. Republic Act 1199 or the Agricultural Tenancy Act was passed to govern to the relationship between the landowners and the tenant farmers, protecting tenurial rights of the tenants and enforce tenancy practices. Through this law, the Court of Agricultural Relationship was created in 1955 to improve the tenancy security, fixed land, retails of tenanted farms, and resolve land despite of failed by the landowners and peasant of the peasant of the organization. So the Agricultural Tenancy Commission was also established to administer problems created by the tenancy. The agricultural created the cooperated financing. It is also created mainly to provide warehouse facilities and also to assess the farmers in marketing in their products. The administration of superhead that established from the agricultures of the industrial back to provide easier terms in applying the homestead and other farmers. So, NAR accelerated to the government resettlement program and distribute the agricultural land to landless tenants and farmers. It is also aimed to convince members of the Hanks, rebels in Luzon, to result in areas where they can restart lives as special citizens. Despite a vigorous effort towards agrarian reform, the situations of the farmers remained dire, since the government lacked and provided inadequate support services to the program. The landed elite did not fully cooperate and criticized the programs. The next president, Diosdado Macapagal, a major stride in land reform arrived during his term through the Agricultural Land Reform Code, Republic Act No. 3844. So, an advancement of land reform in the Philippines, he established in 1936 under his presidential.
So, when we talk about the land reform, we're talking about getting rid of tenancy and replacing it with a system in which farmers pay landlord a fixed rental rather than a percentage of their harvest.
Agrarian reform efforts under Marcos. President Marcos declared martial law in 1972, enabling him to essentially wipe out the landlord-dominated Congress. Through his technocrats, he was able to expand executive power to start a fundamental restructuring of government, including its efforts in solving the deep structural problems of the countryside. The primary source of Presidential Decree Number 27, signed last October 21, 1972, which says emancipating the tenant farmers from the bondage of the soils. This presidential decree states that in one stroke, the tenant farmers of private agricultural lands primarily devoted to rice and corn under a system of sharecrop or lease tenancy, whether classified as landed estate or not. In all cases, the landowner may retain an area of not more than 7 hectares if such landowner is cultivating such area or will now cultivate it. For the purpose of determining the cost of the land to be transferred to the tenant farmer pursuant to this decree, the value of the land shall be equivalent to 2.5 times the average harvest of 3 normal crop years immediately preceding the promulgation of this decree. And it also states that the total cost of the land shall be paid by the tenant in 15 years. The amortization due shall be paid by the farmers' cooperative in which the defaulting tenant farmer is a member, with the cooperative having a right of recourse against him. Lands that are no titled under this decree shall be issued to a tenant farmer. The Department of Agrarian Reform, through its secretary, is hereby empowered to promulgate rules and regulations for the implementation of this decree. Under the Rice Self-Sufficiency Program, Masagana 99, farmers were able to borrow from banks and purchase 3-hectare plots of lands and agricultural inputs. However, the landlord class still found ways to circumvent the law because only rice lands were the focus of agrarian reform. Some landlords only needed to change crops to the exempted from the program, such as coconut and sugar lands. Landlessness increased, which made it all the more difficult for the program to succeed because landless peasants were excluded from the program. Many other methods were employed by the elite to find a way to maintain their power and dominance, which were worsened by the corruption of Marcos and his cronies who were also involved in the agricultural sector.
Discuss about post-1986 agrarian reform. The overthrow of Marcos, the 1987 constitution, resulted as a renewed interest and attention to agrarian reform as a President Corazon Aquino envisioned agrarian reform to the centerpiece of her administration's social legislation, which proved difficult because her background betrayed her. She came from a family of a wealthy and landed that owned the Hacienda Lucita. On 22 July 1987, Aquino issued the Presidential Proclamation 131 and Executive Order 229, which outlined her land reform program. In 1988, the Congress passed Republic Act No. 6667, or the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, CARL, which introduced a program with the same name, Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, or CARP. It enabled the redistribution of agricultural lands to tenant farmers from landowners who were paid in exchange by the government through just compensation, and allowed them to retain not more than a few hectares. Corporate landowners were, however, allowed under the law to voluntarily divest a proportion of their capital, stock, quality, or participation in favor of their workers or their qualified beneficiaries instead of turning over their land to the government. CARP was limited because it was accomplished very little during the administration of Aquino. It only accomplished 22.5% of land distribution in 6 years, owing to the fact that Congress, dominated by the land elite, was willing to fund the high compensation cost of the program. It was also mired in controversy since Aquino seemingly bowed down to the pressure of her relatives by allowing the stock redistribution option. Hacienda Lucita reorganized itself into a corporation and distribution stocks to farmers. Under the term of President Ramos, CARP implementation was speeded as ordered to meet the 10-year frame despite limitations and constraints in funding, logistics, and participation of involved sectors. By 1996, the Department of Agrarian Reform distributed only 58.25% of the total target to be covered by the program. To address the lacking of funding and the dwindling time for the implementations of CARP, Ramos assigned Republic Act No. 6532 to 1988 to amend CARP and extended the program to another 10 years. That's all. Thank you.